Hey guys, welcome to a little behind the scenes. We're in my editing den right now, so I'm tacking this on to the start of the video to let you know if you're not the kind of person who wants to sit and watch me sit in a car and talk about the downfalls of lifted Hondas, specifically the rear suspension and the rear brakes, what I'm trying to do to fix it and why that's led me to stop working on the Honda and basically shelf it for a year, well, click on out of this video. It's not for you. But if you want to learn why I decided not to K-swap my CR-V, why I stopped recommending lift blocks, and why I've basically halted doing anything on the Honda, well, let's get into it. So I was thinking it's probably a good time now to tell you why I'm not K-swapping the CR-V yet, because I'm obviously still K-swapping it. I said it for a reason. The power to weight ratio you're going to have in an RD1 with a K24, potentially with a turbo, who knows by then, and a re-geared final drive, an LSD in the front and rear, and a viscous coupler setup, it's going to go anywhere. But I was kind of thinking about it, and I was budgeting it out, and I was planning out the stages of my build, and why would I spend what would come close to $12,000 on an engine swap and a boost and all this re-gearing when everything else I want to do before that is going to cost almost that much, and I could do it in the same time? So instead of doing essentially the end goal, the engine swap first, I'm going to do it last. And so that means that I can finally tell you about all these ambiguous big plans I've had for about, I think, a year now. I think a year is how long I've been saying, oh, there's big plans, big changes coming. I haven't done shit yet, but this is where you get to find out. So I'm going to be basically redoing the whole rear end, potentially twice. So there's a few things that are going to go into that. The first thing is, I'm just not satisfied with my rear disc brake setup. No hate, no shade to anyone. Greg Rawls has made a fantastic rear disc brake conversion, but there's just one problem, and it's just I don't think it's suitable for lifted off-road people. So when you put it into perspective, looking back at my old vlogs and thinking about the caliper and where it came from, I don't believe the Prelude caliper, a vehicle that's 400 to 500 kilos lighter, is going to have an acceptable handbrake for a vehicle that much heavier, and then also running 3 to 5 inch thicker tires with big mud tread on steep off-road hills in bad traction. It wasn't designed for that. It's a small caliper, and the rotor's that thin. It's not made to hold that kind of weight, and so that's why I believe mine hasn't been great. I've gone through 2 sets of calipers now, 2 sets of handbrake cables, and I've done both methods of mounting. I've done everything. I've taken it to some brake specialists to inspect every aspect. It just isn't working well, and so I'm going to be redoing that. There's a few options I'm going to look into. I've got a 2nd gen CR-V rear disc brake setup to look at. AU Falcon, they use an internal drum, so that's kind of my last resort, but I know they're the same stud pattern, and they have nice thick big brakes because V6 and V8 engines with rear wheel drive. And then the other option is what Luke Elio, Honda Luke, told me, and that's the RX8 rear brakes. So he's actually said he's using them himself. All it takes is a small bit of machining or grinding of the hub in a place that doesn't hold any weight, so it's perfectly safe to do so. And they're a thick, slotted vented rotor, bigger caliper, and they fit on a 15-inch wheel, so they might be the go. Anyway, those are the 3 options for rear disc brake. I'm going to be looking into all 3 and seeing which is the best for my setup. The benefit to all of them is that it's going to, 1, have an upright bleeder, but 2, just have better braking performance. I will say the rear disc brake I have currently for on-road and off-road performance in terms of braking is fantastic, but the handbrake just doesn't cut it. Anyway, so moving on from there, the more important thing. So I'm basically going to be redesigning and rebuilding my entire rear suspension. So that's starting at the control arms, It's going to be removing things like my camber drop bracket, and I'm going to tell you why. So, no shade or hate to anyone. I've got HRG products in my car, I've got aerogenics products in my car, I've got custom products in my car that I've gotten made at engineering shops, such as my 3-inch trailing arm spacers, and basically all of them have the same shortfall. They're not as thoroughly designed as they could be. And it's no fault or like no shade to any of them. It's the way the product was made. It works for the application it was made for. But I'm looking for something properly robust that's going to last me years and years and years and not cause me any damage. I want to do some big lifts and some cool stuff in my CRV. I want it to be as capable as possible. I'm putting all this money into it. So why would I settle for a part that's not as fully engineered? So again, no shade to anyone. Even though I've had my own misgivings with certain parts and customer service that I'm not going to touch on because I'm not trying to drop hate on anyone or ruin anyone's business. So there's a couple of key things to look at when you're looking at the rear suspension once you're lifted past a certain point and how it all works together. And a big thing to keep in mind is that 3-inch trailing arm spacers, whether they're rectangular or cylindrical, are essentially stilts for your trailing arm. Think about how much force is being dispersed over that small space. Take, for example, a crowbar and pry up and down your trailing arm from anywhere and think about the leverage that's putting on that one spot of your chassis. It's only sheet metal, and that's not the only force it has to deal with, and this is really the big issue. So think about your lower control arm and where it mounts, right? To your subframe and then to your rear trailing arm. And then think about your lower control arm where it mounts to the body and then your trailing arm. So you've got this short arm here and this long arm here. Now think about when that extreme up and down travel happens, it tucks in the wheel or it pushes it out. And that's normal if you're running something like a solid axle where, you know, the wheel is on a beam and it has to do that. But in independent suspension, it's not meant to. And that's a big flaw when you're going off-road, because if you think about the kind of force that's putting on your trailing arm now, say you're tucking a wheel up, you've got, you know, you've compressed your entire suspension up, your wheel's tucking into the guard and it's angling in at that extreme angle. Your whole trailing arm is now twisting. So think about the strain that's putting on your bushings, think about the strain that's putting on your CV axles, and think about the strain that's putting on, you guessed it, your trailing arm spacers. I hate to say it, Jacob Sanders has seen this happen. It sucked to see it happen, but both sides of his trailing arm ripped out. And from what I could tell, it looked like it's from twisting and back and forward motion. That's just the issue with this design, and so there are some key things that need to be overcome with it. So what I've been looking into and what Luke Elio has actually been looking into is solutions for different levels of this. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be installing a kit that Luke has designed, put through 10 or so iterations so far, maybe more. Just an absolutely ridiculous amount of time, and has then actually put it to the test in some frame machines and all these different machines that give him precise information about how things are performing. And what it's come to is he's now built a kit that alleviates a lot of the shortfalls of the trailing arm spacers by tying it into more of the chassis and tying it into part of the actual trailing arm tunnel it bolts into. But then he's also redesigned how the camber arm mounts up. So instead of having a camber arm drop bracket, which puts all this load on the camber arm, which it's not supposed to have, which could potentially cause it to rip out from the body or damage it itself. I know for a fact that my rear camber arm bushings are being significantly worn out after less than 20,000 kilometers, which shouldn't be the case. Again, no shade to anyone, like, it's the part that's on the market, I'm using it for a reason, it is much safer than not having it, so no hate, like, if there wasn't a better solution out there, I would continue to run it, or go back to stock. But anyway, that's beside the point. This new solution will basically take all that load off that camber arm, put it back to the strut where it belongs. and it'll also then, with that trailing arm spacer, allow a lot of that load to come off. But the big issue is you're still dropping everything down, and it's not fixing that issue. So the real solution is a true long arm setup for the rear. So that's almost equal length upper and lower arm. So there's a few things to overcome there in actually mounting the upper arm to the subframe and having equal length upper and lower arms, but that is kind of where I'm thinking my long-term goal is. So obviously the big challenge to overcome here is that you need somewhere to mount that longer upper arm. You can't mount it to the body of the vehicle anymore because it's way too long. So what you need to do is think about how you're going to incorporate that mount into your subframe. You're essentially going to be dropping your subframe 3 inches and tying your subframe together to your rear differential mount. That'll allow you somewhere to place a connecting point for that new upper arm location that's going to be much longer. So if you take a look at something like your pre-runner vehicles or your competition trophy trucks that are using independent suspension, even like light armored military class vehicles that are supposed to travel at high speeds off-road, they're all using a double wishbone suspension in the rear of equal length arms. Now we can't use the wishbone suspension, but we can incorporate this equal length upper and lower arm, and what we'll gain from that is a much better performing all independent suspension for off-road. It'll allow us to get greater travel, put longer shocks and bigger lift onto it without compromising the integrity of things like your chassis from the twisting of the trailing arm, or from things like just oversteering and understeering from having bad camber angles as you go through your travel. So these are the type of vehicles you really need to keep in mind and look at when thinking about how this all works. It's not going to be working like a CRV because the inherent design of a CRV for off-road use doesn't work when you start putting blocks in the way. So with that all said, my alternate plan, should that not be resolved, is taking a beam axle from a Honda HRV 98 to 2004 and slapping it on the back of a CRV, because a beam axle is basically the kind of independent suspension similar to a solid axle, but the specialty with the HRV is it retains the same track width, the same axle splining, and the same differential as the first gen CRV. That dual pump diff, that's what it's got. It's a much more robust system than the trailing arm. However, I would prefer to keep things all independent if possible. So that, along with the fact that I need to do things like my bar work, my bash plate, and, you know, a lot of the camping mods I still want to do. That's why I'm not K-swapping it yet. I know I said I was going to be doing it this year, but I just kind of rushed into that decision. I thought it was the right move, and it just turned out to not be the right move for a long time. So I will still be doing it, but this will actually give me the opportunity to do stuff that's more important and more beneficial to my build and probably to the lifted Honda community. So I thought that would be great knowledge to share with you all finally. So now we can flash back 2 months and go to the best camping trip I've had in my life. We saw platypus. It was fucking cool. I've seen them once in my life before. Wild.